The most powerful empire on earth was about to face its worst nightmare. Egypt controlled the ancient world with iron fists and golden treasures, but one man stood before Pharaoh's throne with a message that would shake the very foundations of the kingdom. His name was Moses, and he carried a warning from the God of the enslaved Hebrews. What happened next would become the most terrifying demonstration of divine power the world had ever witnessed. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Pharaoh's palace. Moses, now 80 years old, walked through the grand entrance with his brother Aaron by his side. The last time Moses had been in this palace, he was a prince of Egypt, raised as the adopted grandson of the previous Pharaoh. Now he returned as a shepherd with calloused hands and sun-weathered skin, claiming to speak for a god that Egypt refused to acknowledge. Pharaoh Ramesses sat on his throne, surrounded by his advisors and magicians. Gold adorned every surface, and servants fanned the air with enormous palm leaves. The ruler of Egypt looked down at Moses with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. This was the man who had fled Egypt 40 years ago after killing an Egyptian overseer. Now he dared to return with demands. Moses spoke with a voice that echoed through the throne room. He demanded that Pharaoh release the Hebrew slaves so they could worship their God in the wilderness. The request seemed absurd to the Egyptian ruler. These slaves built his monuments and cities. They created his wealth. Why would he ever let them go? Pharaoh laughed and asked a question that would seal his fate. He wanted to know who this Hebrew god was and why he should obey him. The Egyptian ruler worshipped many gods, powerful deities like Ra, the sun god, and Hapi, the god of the Nile. He himself was considered divine. What was one more god to him? Aaron threw down his staff, and it transformed into a serpent right there on the palace floor. The courtiers gasped, but Pharaoh remained unmoved. He called forward his own magicians, and they performed the same trick through their secret arts. Their staffs also became serpents. But then something unexpected happened. Aaron's serpent consumed all the others, swallowing them whole. The Egyptian magicians stepped back in shock, but Pharaoh hardened his heart. He would not release the slaves. Moses and Aaron left the palace and went straight to the Nile River the next morning. The Nile was everything to Egypt. It provided water, food, transportation, and life itself. The Egyptians worshipped it as a god. They believed Hapi blessed them with its annual floods that made their land fertile. Without the Nile, Egypt would be nothing but desert sand. A crowd gathered along the riverbank as Moses raised his staff over the sacred waters. Pharaoh had come down to the river for his morning ritual, and he watched with his arms crossed. Moses declared that the God of the Hebrews would now show Egypt his power. He struck the water with his staff. The change happened instantly. The clear blue water turned deep crimson. It looked like blood, and it smelled like blood. Within moments, the entire Nile had transformed. Fish began floating to the surface, their white bellies turning up as they died in the contaminated water. The smell of death filled the air. People screamed and ran from the riverbank. Every water source in Egypt was affected. The water in jars and storage containers turned to blood. The wells became unusable. The irrigation channels that fed the crops ran red. For 7 days, the Egyptians had no fresh water to drink. They dug desperately along the banks of the Nile, hoping to find clean water filtered through the sand. The mighty river that gave them life had become a river of death. Pharaoh called his magicians again, and through their enchantments, they too turned water into blood. The king used this as justification to ignore Moses' warning. If his magicians could do the same thing, then this Hebrew god was no more powerful than Egypt's own sorcerers. He refused to let the people go. The first plague had come and gone, but it was only the beginning of Egypt's suffering. If you're enjoying this incredible story of divine power and ancient drama, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this powerful message today. 7 days passed, and the Nile slowly returned to normal. The dead fish had been cleared away, and the Egyptians began to feel relief. They had survived the curse. Life would return to normal. But Moses appeared at the palace again with the same demand. "Let my people go." Pharaoh, sitting comfortably on his throne once more, refused again. He had survived one plague. He could survive whatever came next. Moses warned him that a new plague would come, but Pharaoh dismissed him with a wave of his hand. The Hebrew prophet left the palace, extended his staff over the rivers and streams of Egypt, and called forth the second plague. What emerged from the waters would invade every corner of Egyptian life. Frogs came first in small numbers, hopping onto the muddy banks of the Nile. Then dozens more appeared, then hundreds, then thousands. Within hours, millions of frogs covered the land of Egypt. They were everywhere and in everything. They hopped through the streets of every city and village. They invaded homes, jumping onto beds and into ovens. They crawled into kneading bowls where women prepared bread. They filled the palace itself, jumping onto Pharaoh's throne and into his bedchamber. The croaking was deafening. Day and night, the sound of millions of frogs filled the air. People could not sleep or think or work. They crushed frogs with every step they took. The creatures climbed up their legs and into their clothing. Children cried as frogs jumped on their faces. The elderly could not escape them. Rich and poor alike suffered under this plague. The Egyptians worshipped Heket, a frog-headed goddess of fertility and childbirth. They considered frogs sacred creatures, but now these sacred animals had become a curse. The thing they honored had turned against them. The irony was not lost on Moses, who knew that the God of the Hebrews was systematically dismantling Egypt's entire belief system. Pharaoh called for Moses urgently. The king could not stand one more day of this torment. He begged Moses to ask his God to remove the frogs, and he promised that he would let the Hebrew people go to worship their God. Moses agreed and asked Pharaoh when he wanted the frogs removed. Pharaoh said tomorrow, and Moses granted his request to prove that this was not a natural event but an act of God. The next day, the frogs died. All of them, millions upon millions of frogs, dropped dead simultaneously across Egypt. The relief lasted only moments before a new horror set in. The dead frogs had to be dealt with. The Egyptians gathered them into enormous piles that stretched as high as small hills. The smell of rotting frogs filled every city and village. The stench was unbearable. It penetrated everything, and the odor of death hung over Egypt like a thick fog. But as soon as the frogs were gone, Pharaoh changed his mind. His heart hardened again. He saw that the immediate threat had passed, so he broke his promise. He would not release the slaves. Moses had removed the plague exactly as promised, but Pharaoh's pride would not allow him to submit. The Egyptian ruler convinced himself that the worst was over. He was wrong. Moses did not bother returning to the palace this time. At God's command, Aaron simply stretched out his staff and struck the dust of the ground. Instantly, the dust transformed. Every particle of dirt across Egypt became a living creature. Gnats swarmed up from the earth in clouds so thick they blocked out the sun. Some translations call them lice or fleas, but whatever the exact insect, they were tiny, biting, and absolutely everywhere. These insects covered every person and every animal in Egypt. They crawled into eyes and ears and noses. They burrowed into hair and clothing. The Egyptians could not eat without consuming gnats. They could not breathe without inhaling them. The insects bit and irritated the skin, causing constant itching and discomfort. Animals went mad, trying to escape the swarms, but there was no escape anywhere in the land. Pharaoh called his magicians to duplicate this plague as they had done with the previous ones. The sorcerers tried their secret arts and their enchantments, but nothing worked. They could not create gnats from the dust. For the first time, the magicians admitted defeat. They told Pharaoh directly that this was the finger of God, a power beyond their understanding or ability to replicate. Even Egypt's most powerful occult practitioners recognized they were dealing with something far greater than themselves. But Pharaoh would not listen, not even to his own advisors. His heart remained hard. The gnats continued their torment, and the king refused to yield. He had gone too far to turn back now. Releasing the slaves would mean admitting he was wrong, admitting that a slave's God was more powerful than Pharaoh himself. His pride would not permit such humiliation. The God of the Hebrews was patient but persistent. 3 plagues had come, and 7 more would follow. Each one would be worse than the last. Each one would strike at the heart of Egyptian worship and power. Pharaoh thought he was strong enough to endure. He thought his kingdom was too mighty to fall. He was about to learn that no earthly power can stand against the will of the Almighty. The 4th plague arrived without warning. Dense swarms of flies filled the air over Egypt, but these were not ordinary flies. They came in such numbers that they darkened the sky. The buzzing sound was so loud it drowned out normal conversation. These flies were aggressive and filthy, spreading disease wherever they went. They covered food and made eating nearly impossible. They crawled over sleeping people's faces at night. The torment was relentless. But something different happened with this plague. God made a distinction between the Egyptians and the Hebrews. The swarms of flies covered every inch of Egyptian territory, but in Goshen, where the Hebrew slaves lived, there was not a single fly. The border was clear and obvious. On one side, chaos and suffering. On the other side, peace and protection. This supernatural division proved beyond doubt that a higher power was orchestrating these events. Pharaoh saw this distinction and realized that Moses truly spoke for a powerful deity. He called Moses to the palace and offered a compromise. The Hebrews could sacrifice to their God, but they had to do it within Egypt. They could not leave. Moses refused the offer. He explained that the Hebrews would be sacrificing animals that the Egyptians considered sacred. If they did this in Egypt, the Egyptians would stone them to death. They needed to go 3 days' journey into the wilderness. Pharaoh then offered another compromise. They could go, but not very far. Moses agreed to pray for the removal of the flies, but he warned Pharaoh not to deal deceitfully again by refusing to let the people go after the plague ended. God removed the flies completely, not one remained. And just as Moses had warned, Pharaoh hardened his heart again and refused to release the slaves. The 5th plague targeted Egypt's wealth directly. A severe pestilence struck all the Egyptian livestock. Their horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats began dying by the thousands. This was devastating to Egypt's economy. Livestock represented wealth, transportation, food, and agricultural power. The animals died so quickly that the Egyptians could not even salvage the meat. The carcasses had to be burned or buried before disease spread further. Once again, God protected the Hebrew livestock. Not a single animal belonging to the Israelites died. Pharaoh sent officials to verify this, and they reported back that it was true. Every Egyptian animal was dead or dying, but the Hebrew herds remained healthy and strong. The supernatural protection was undeniable. Yet Pharaoh's heart remained unmoved. He would not let the people go. Moses and Aaron appeared before Pharaoh again, and this time they brought handfuls of furnace soot. They threw it into the air in Pharaoh's presence, and it spread across Egypt like a fine dust. Wherever this dust touched skin, painful boils erupted. These were not minor blemishes, but large, festering sores that covered people from head to foot. The pain was excruciating. The boils oozed and bled, making it nearly impossible to move or work. Even Pharaoh's magicians were afflicted so badly they could not stand before Moses. Their entire bodies were covered in boils. The Egyptian physicians had no cure for this plague. Their ointments and remedies were useless against these supernatural sores. People lay in their homes, crying out in agony, unable to find relief. The proud Egyptians, who considered themselves the most advanced civilization on earth, were reduced to helpless suffering. Still, Pharaoh would not break. His own body was likely covered in painful boils, yet his stubbornness remained. The pattern had become clear. Each plague was worse than the one before. Each one struck at a different aspect of Egyptian life and religion, and each one left the Hebrews completely untouched. The message was obvious to everyone except the one person who needed to hear it most. Moses warned Pharaoh that the next plague would be unlike anything Egypt had ever experienced. He told the king to bring all his remaining livestock and his servants indoors because a terrible storm was coming. Some of Pharaoh's officials feared the word of Moses and brought their servants and animals inside. Others, who had hardened their hearts like their king, left everything in the fields. The seventh plague began with thunder that shook the ground. Then came hail, but not ordinary hail. These were massive chunks of ice mixed with fire. Lightning darted through the hail in a supernatural display that defied natural laws. Fire and ice fell together from the sky, destroying everything in their path. The hail struck down every person and animal left in the fields. It shattered trees and stripped every plant down to bare stalks. The crops that had survived the previous plagues were now completely destroyed. The devastation was total. Egypt's barley and flax crops, which were nearly ready for harvest, were obliterated. The wheat and spelt survived only because they ripened later in the season. But the damage to Egypt's food supply was catastrophic. The nation faced the real possibility of famine. The Egyptians had never seen such a storm. Their weather was normally predictable and mild. This apocalyptic display of power left them terrified. Pharaoh called for Moses urgently. For the first time, the king admitted he had sinned. He confessed that the Lord was righteous and that he and his people were wicked. He begged Moses to pray for the storm to end, promising once again to let the people go. Moses agreed, knowing full well what would happen next. He went out from the city and spread his hands to the Lord. The thunder, hail, and rain stopped immediately. As soon as the danger passed, Pharaoh and his officials hardened their hearts again. The king broke his promise once more. The temporary fear was forgotten, replaced by stubborn pride. Moses must have felt a mixture of frustration and sorrow. How many more times would this cycle repeat? How much more suffering would Egypt endure before Pharaoh finally yielded? Don't forget to like this video and leave a comment below telling us which plague you find most terrifying. Your engagement helps spread this powerful message to more people who need to hear it. God sent Moses back to Pharaoh with a new message. The Lord explained that he had hardened Pharaoh's heart for a purpose. These plagues would become stories told for generations. They would demonstrate to the world that there is no God like the God of Israel. The Egyptians, the Hebrews, and all nations would learn that the Lord does according to his will in the armies of heaven and among the inhabitants of earth. The eighth plague came from the east. A wind began blowing, and it carried something that filled the Egyptians with dread. Locusts appeared on the horizon, in a cloud so vast it looked like a moving mountain. Millions upon millions of locusts swept across Egypt. They covered the ground until it was black. They consumed every green thing that had survived the hail. They ate every blade of grass, every leaf on every tree, and every remaining crop in the fields. The locusts entered homes through windows and doors. They crawled over everything, leaving their droppings and their discarded wings. The sound of their wings and their eating was like a rushing river. They devoured Egypt's remaining food supply completely. The nation that had once been the breadbasket of the ancient world now faced starvation. Even Pharaoh's officials begged him to let the Hebrews go before Egypt was completely destroyed. Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron before him and asked who exactly wanted to go. Moses said everyone would go, young and old, sons and daughters, flocks and herds. They would all go because they needed to hold a feast to the Lord. Pharaoh refused this condition. He said only the men could go. Moses rejected this compromise and left the palace. The locusts remained until Pharaoh called him back, begging for relief. God sent a powerful west wind that caught up the locusts and blew them into the Red Sea. Not a single locust remained in Egypt. Pharaoh's heart hardened again the moment the locusts were gone. His stubbornness had become almost inhuman. How could anyone endure 8 devastating plagues and still refuse to submit? But pride is a powerful force, and Pharaoh's pride had consumed his reason. He could not see that he was destroying his own kingdom with his obstinacy. Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and the 9th plague descended on Egypt. Darkness covered the land. But this was not the darkness of night. This was a thick, tangible darkness that could be felt. The Egyptians could not see their hands in front of their faces. They could not move from their places because the darkness was so complete and oppressive. It pressed down on them like a physical weight. For 3 days, they sat in this supernatural blackness, unable to work, unable to function, gripped by fear. This plague struck at the heart of Egyptian worship. The Egyptians worshipped Ra, the sun god. They believed Pharaoh himself was the son of Ra. The sun was the center of their religion and their understanding of the cosmos. Now their sun god could not help them. The sun still rose, but its light could not penetrate the darkness that covered Egypt. The God of the Hebrews had overcome their most powerful deity with ease. Yet in the homes of the Hebrews, there was light. The Israelites could see perfectly well in Goshen, while just beyond their borders, the Egyptians sat in supernatural darkness. The contrast could not have been more striking. 2 peoples living in the same region, but experiencing completely different realities based on their relationship with God. When the darkness lifted, Pharaoh called Moses again. This time he said the people could all go, even the children, but their livestock had to stay behind. Moses refused. They needed their animals for sacrifices and worship. Every hoof had to go with them. Pharaoh exploded in rage. He told Moses to leave his presence and never come back. If Moses ever appeared before him again, he would die. Moses agreed. He would not see Pharaoh's face again, but he had one more message to deliver. Moses told Pharaoh about the final plague. At midnight, the Lord would go throughout Egypt, and every firstborn in the land would die. Every firstborn son, from the heir to Pharaoh's throne to the son of the lowliest slave girl. Even the firstborn of the livestock would die. There would be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than anything ever heard before or ever to be heard again. But among the Israelites, not even a dog would bark. The distinction between Egypt and Israel would be absolutely clear. Moses warned that after this plague, all of Pharaoh's officials would come bowing down to him, begging the Hebrews to leave. Then Moses turned and left Pharaoh's presence in hot anger. The die was cast. The final plague was coming, and it would break Pharaoh's will completely. God gave specific instructions to the Hebrews. On the 10th day of the month, each family was to select a lamb without defect. They were to keep it until the 14th day, then slaughter it at twilight. They were to take the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the doorframes of their houses. They were to roast the lamb and eat it that night with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. They were to eat it quickly, dressed and ready to travel, because this was the Lord's Passover. God explained that he would pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, but when he saw the blood on the doorframes, he would pass over that house. The blood would be a sign, a mark of protection. The Hebrews followed these instructions exactly. They slaughtered the lambs, applied the blood, roasted the meat, and ate the Passover meal with their families. They waited in their homes, listening to the night, knowing that judgment was coming to Egypt. At midnight it happened. The Lord struck down every firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the prisoner in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock as well. Pharaoh woke to the sound of screaming. His own firstborn son was dead. He ran through the palace and found every servant's firstborn dead. The wailing began in the palace and spread throughout the entire nation. There was not a house in Egypt without death. Mothers held dead children. Fathers discovered dead sons. The young heir who would inherit the farm was gone. The oldest daughter who would carry on the family name was dead. The crying and mourning rose like a wave across the land. The proud nation that had enslaved and oppressed the Hebrews for 400 years now experienced a fraction of that suffering in a single night. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron during the night. The proud king who had refused 9 times now begged them to leave. He told them to take their people, their flocks, their herds, everything, and go worship their God. Just go. Leave Egypt. He even asked for a blessing, hoping that Moses' God would show him mercy and stop the destruction. The Egyptian people urged the Hebrews to hurry and leave, fearing that they would all be dead soon if the Israelites remained. The Hebrews left Egypt that night, approximately 600,000 men on foot, plus women and children. They took their dough before the yeast was added and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in clothing. They also asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, and the Egyptians gave them whatever they requested. The people who had enslaved them now paid them for their years of labor. The Hebrews plundered Egypt as they left. The children of Israel had lived in Egypt for 430 years. To the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt. It was a night to be remembered, a night when the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob displayed his power over the mightiest empire on earth. Pharaoh and his gods had been defeated. The slaves were free. The impossible had happened. The 10 plagues of Egypt stand as a testimony to God's power and faithfulness. He heard the cries of his oppressed people and delivered them with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Each plague was a direct challenge to the gods of Egypt, proving them powerless before the one true God. The Nile god could not stop the water from turning to blood. Heket could not control the frogs. Ra could not penetrate the darkness. Even Pharaoh, who claimed to be divine, could not protect his own firstborn son. The story teaches us about the consequences of stubborn pride and hardened hearts. Pharaoh had multiple chances to avoid the worst plagues, but each time he refused to submit. His pride cost him everything: his heir, his nation's wealth, his people's lives, and his own reputation. The king who thought himself a god was humbled by the God who truly reigns over all. For the Hebrews, this story became the foundation of their identity as a nation. They would retell it every year at Passover, teaching their children about the night God passed over their homes because of the blood on the doorframes. This blood would point forward to another Passover lamb who would be sacrificed centuries later to provide salvation not just from physical slavery, but from spiritual death. The plagues demonstrate that God sees injustice and responds to it. He does not forget his promises, even when centuries pass. He remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he acted decisively to fulfill it. The God who delivered Israel from Egypt is the same God who delivers his people today from bondage to sin and death. This ancient story still resonates because it speaks to universal human experiences: the struggle between oppression and freedom, the battle between pride and humility, the question of who truly holds power in this world. Egypt's empire seemed invincible, but it crumbled before the word of God. Pharaoh seemed all-powerful, but he was broken by plagues he could not stop or control. The 10 plagues remind us that earthly power is temporary and limited. Political authority, military might, economic strength, all of these things can vanish in a moment when God decides to act. The only lasting power is the power of the one who created heaven and earth, who commands the waters and the winds, who numbers our days and knows our hearts. If this story has impacted you today, make sure you're subscribed to this channel for more powerful biblical content. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Share this video with your friends and family who need to hear these timeless truths. Drop a comment below and let us know what spoke to you most about this incredible account of God's power and faithfulness. Your support helps us continue creating content that changes lives and draws people closer to understanding God's Word.